Dear students, good morning. Let us start the discussion on today's newspaper, that is 31st January 2018. The first article, The Roadmap for Renewal. This is about economic survey. You already know that economic survey is more becoming a scholarly document. In this context, it has given certain startling facts about the Indian economy. The Jam Trinity, twin balance sheet problem, all these are brought out by the economic survey. So this year also economic survey has given certain facts before us. One among them is the tax GDP ratio inertia appears to be reversing in India. Remember this word, tax GDP ratio inertia, because previously it was stuck at 4%. In spite of the economy growing, the tax payers are not growing in the country. And this is said to be one of the reasons for rising inequalities. This year, there is growth in the net taxpayers by 50%, and one way we can attribute the success to demonetization and GST introduction. And the second aspect is our non-agriculture sector is not as informal as we think. It means that Indian economy is moving more towards formalization. As formal economy rises, the amount of or the net taxpayers are bound to increase. And third factor is in Indian economy, the exports of the country are not diversified. Here I am not talking about product diversification. I am talking about the exporter diversification. So the top 1% of the exporters, they do not form a major chunk of the exports. If you take China or Japan, or if you take South Korea, few companies dominate the export sector. South Korea is a typical example. Samsung, LG, Hyundai, these dominate that. It means in India, the small and medium enterprises dominate the export sector. Here there are two concerns. Either Indian small enterprises have no incentive to grow big, or is it good to have the multiple enterprises as diverse as possible to be involved with the export sector. So what is exactly happening? That clarity we need over here. And the next thing which he spoke about is populism that can be a possibility. So most of the people in India even today are dependent on agriculture, and agricultural growth is going down this year after a tremendous growth last year. And the government has an objective to double the farmers' income. It means as elections are nearing and the objective to double the farmers' income is on books, makes the government to go for a farmer-friendly budget with higher subsidies. And it can affect the fiscal discipline. And there are other factors that also can affect the fiscal discipline. One is rising oil prices. So for the last 3.5 years, the oil prices are low. And it has provided triple benefit to Indian economy. What are they? Inflation is on lower side, fiscal deficit and the current account deficit, all these are on the lower side. So now, oil prices are rising. It means that these advantages India is going to lose soon. And second aspect is the disinvestment. The government has overachieved the disinvestment this year. As stock markets are skyrocketing, government is also expected to achieve its disinvestment targets in the coming year. So that is a positive sign for the fiscal discipline. So the oil prices and the populistic budget, these are the things that can destabilize the fiscal discipline. But disinvestment targets, they are in favor of fiscal discipline. And the next aspect is US Fed rate hike. It is external factor that is going to influence the Indian economy. As US is on a growth path and inflation is slowly rising there, employment back on track, it can make the US Fed to withdraw the stimulus and it can lead to tightening of the monetary policy. Obviously, that leads to rise in interest rates. As the interest rates in US rise, the capital is expected to shift from developing economies to United States of America. This flight of capital can affect the balance of payment situation in the country. And inequalities. So recently Oxfam report, if you remember, The top 1% of the people own 73% of the wealth in the country. So it means inequalities are rising like never before. So addressing these inequalities is a greater concern. So how can we use the fiscal policy to address the inequalities? Redistribution of wealth through rise in direct taxes. And indirect taxes have to be reduced because indirect taxes will worst affect the poor. So indirect taxes need to be reduced and direct taxes need to be increased. So the fiscal policy have to play a role in reducing these inequalities. Another concern expressed was related to tax disputes. Now here, normally the tax disputes goes this way. First there will be a superintendent, he will make some assessments, it goes to the assistant commissioner, appellate commissioner, then tribunal, then to high court, then to Supreme Court. This is what is the hierarchy on which the tax disputes are resolved. So once that assessment officer makes certain remarks, none in the department will be willing to change that. So they end up in courts. What is the reason? Because none of the officer is interested to take a risk. It may lead to an allegation of collusion or corruption against him. And there is no incentive for him to amicably solve the issue at his level. Because of this, more than 8 lakh rupees are being stuck in this litigation. So the speedy redressal of tax disputes is essential for ease of doing business. And next is patents. The patents are pending before the government and is going to stifle the creative economy in the country. So these are the issues which are raised by the economic survey and these are mentioned in this article. The balancing act. So this is about India-ASEAN relations. If you see, Southeast Asia is more under the influence of China and USA played the balancing act over there. Now as Trump became the president, he wants US action to be less on the foreign field. Then it is causing a concern for ASEAN countries. So ASEAN is looking towards India for a balancing act. They want India to be proactive towards a regional architecture and its stability. And second aspect is to what extent India can benefit from it. India's benefits are both strategic and also economical. So in this context, the massive Chinese infrastructure projects and the trade with Southeast Asia, India is in no match. India has to move its steps a bit fast. So in the last summit, we can divide the issues into politico-security cooperation, trade, economic, culture and connectivity issues. Under political and security cooperation, maritime cooperation was central. And then freedom of navigation and overflight in South China Sea. So this is directed against China itself. Now, a collective objective of India-ASEAN is to bring China into some legally binding framework on South China Sea issue. And second is, if you come to trade and economic relations, RCEP has become central to the discussion. A regional comprehensive economic partnership. In this, the norms are much tighter than the WTO. And there is an excessive emphasis on trade in goods and the patents. In this context, India's much major focus is on trade in services. So as the trade in services are not being in the part of RCEP, India is reluctant to move forward. But if India has to realize the full potential of relations with ASEAN, this RCEP has to be signed. And India to raise its bargaining power, it needs to have good relations with the ASEAN. And culture. So Islam, Ramayana and then Buddhism, these are the cultural connects of India with the ASEAN. Connectivity, yes, we have initiated a set of connectivity projects, but they are not kicking off as expected. So these are the things we need to take the concerns. A wider net. So it is about rise in net taxpayers. You know that the number of people who are filing the tax returns has increased by 50%. As their personal incomes increase, the revenues to the state are also bound to increase. Now remember, when the tax payments will increase to the state, When the state in return is able to provide for social security benefits, the government has to take immediate steps to provide for social security benefits, especially for the middle class whose incomes are rising. And second aspect is GDP, tax GDP ratio is stagnant in India, and the present environment shows that it is bound to increase in the coming years. And it is the time India has to shift from indirect taxes to direct taxes. As you know that indirect taxes will affect poor and rich equally, and these are regressive. And direct taxes are progressive as they bring in redistribution of wealth from rich to the poor, and they reduce the inequalities. Indirect taxes raise the inequalities. Direct taxes reduces the inequalities. That effort has to start in India. That is what is the major point here. Seas of terror. It is about Afghanistan. Previously, Taliban was the major concern of terrorism in Afghanistan. Now, Islamic State is growing at a fast rate. So, Islamic State, as it is losing territory in Syria and Iraq, it is focusing on new grounds. Afghanistan appears to be a ripe ground. So, whenever the state structure is in disarray and there is corruption and people have resentment against the state, then that can be a proper ground for the terrorism to grow. All these are existing in Afghanistan now. So the Afghan state is unable to spread its writ beyond the Kabul. And the local provinces, they are acting independent of the central government. Few days back we saw the article of Rakesh Sood. And then the internal rift across the government between Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, the president and CEO. And then we have high levels of corruption in the Kabul government. And America sees the issues in Afghanistan from a military perspective rather than from a development and reconstruction perspective. So these are all giving ripe grounds for the Taliban and ISIS to hold their foot on in the Afghanistan. Now let's get into open it. Fiscal populism would be really counterproductive. So what Mr. Aravind Subramanian, the chief economic advisor, is trying to state is this. When we are on an economic growth path, it is the time for us to consolidate the fiscal discipline. It means that if resorting to fiscal populism by the government at this juncture, it can destabilize the growth path that has been achieved with pains. And second is, the twin balance sheet syndrome appears to be receding. So, and also, the people of India has to gain confidence on the capitalism. So the word he has specifically used over here is called stigmatized capitalism. Why is this happening? Most of the funds to the private corporate entities are going from the public banks, which are owned by the government. Because of this, with the public money, few people are getting rich. That is what is the opinion people hold in this country. So that's why more and more private banks has to come. Private capital shall lead to private investments. That is a healthy development. And recapitalization of the banks, insolvency, bankruptcy code to an extent can address the problem of twin balance sheet syndrome. There are other risks which he is talking about. One is rising oil prices. And also, there is a huge gap between the earnings of the corporate sector and rise in the stock markets in India. The stock markets are rising, but the corporate earnings are not in proportion to the rise in stock markets. And major reason for this is, after demonetization, many of the small investors have entered into the stock markets. As the gulf is becoming wide, there is a greater chance that it may lead to collapse. So we need to be cautious about it, and SEBI has to keep a vigilant eye on this particular market. And then the twin balance sheet syndrome is the major reason why we fail to achieve the double-digit growth. That's what Mr. Aravind Subramanian states. And then let's go to the front page. Allahabad High Court Judge Shukla to be impeached. Now, the Chief Justice of India, Justice Deepak Mishra, wrote to President for initiating the impeachment of High Court Judge, Allahabad High Court Judge, Mr. Narayan Shukla. So, here I have a small doubt. Can judiciary initiate the process of impeachment, or judiciary is just advising it? Let me put it this way. Parliament has to initiate a motion, and after that it has to go to the three-member committee, and this three-member committee shall consist of Chief Justice of India, Judge of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice of High Court, or an eminent jurist, and then it has to decide either there is a misconduct or incapacity on the part of the judge. So when we have these two things, when they are approved by this, then only voting can happen in the parliament. And it has to be passed with special majority. Then the President of India can remove the judge from the office. That is what is the procedure which is set in. Here, Chief Justice of India recommending to the President for the removal of a judge. So is this procedure is appropriate or not? I need to verify that. CEA flags impact of market correction on retail investors. As I said to you before, the small investors have entered into the stock markets. Then the market correction or market adjust may affect their interests. That's what is advised to us is. Government backs down on orange passports. The orange passports are like a discrimination. If you see, Germany used to issue the passports with big J to the Jews, and it was highly discriminatory. No state document shall discriminate between the people on the social, political, or economic grounds. Here, orange passports were intended for migrant laborers who needs immigration check. So that is going to be a discrimination based on occupation and economic status. And then skill development to get a leg up. So the skill development ecosystem has to be created in India. For this, improving subsidies for the skill development programs, providing for the employment opportunities through the skill development institutions and corporate connect, and improving the apprenticeship programs at the industries. All these are the important steps. Here there are two programs which are being spoken about. One is Sankalp and the other one is Strive. Sankalp, the skill acquisition, knowledge awareness and livelihood promotion, and skill value enhancement, that is the Strive. So these are the two programs which may get budgetary support. That's what this article talks about. And then simultaneous polls, a mere jumla, says Chidambaram. So now this argument for the simultaneous polls is coming from a centralizing tendency. So when I say centralizing tendency, Indian political system is highly centralized, and the charismatic leadership has to involve themselves with the elections. So that inconvenience of the leaders at the top is the reason which this demand is growing up. That is one of the argument. And second is instability and delay in democracy. We need not see them only from a negative perspective. They have their own unique advantages. So whenever there is a problem in the government, it is the right of the citizen to direct the government through elections. It is his right to decide through elections. When we have so many states, obviously we cannot avoid the instability or midterm elections in India. That's what Chidambaram states about. The last page I gave you the notes that will be available to you at laix.in/civilsprep. Thank you very much and all the best.